How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 80 of Masechta Zevachim, which is pretty awesome because Masechta Zevachim is 120 pages. It's been a very difficult Masechta. Would you agree with that analysis, with that assertion, thing? I think it's been pretty challenging. So Daf 80 out of 120 is two-thirds now of the way to Masechta Zevachim, which is amazing. Daf is pretty awesome. We start with a new Mishnah, which discusses blood mixtures. If blood from a balmum gets mixed with the blood of a healthy animal, chatuses with oluses, with bechorses, and all sorts of mixtures of bloods, and what do you do in those scenarios? And this leads into a discussion of the concept of Bilah, which is an interesting discussion of when you have mixtures of liquids, do we view it as though the mixture is thoroughly mixed and therefore any sample from the mixture will contain all of the elements of the mixture? So if you have blood of, let's say, a chatos and an ola, for example, if you take a sample of that blood, will it contain both the chatos and the ola? Right? Is it thoroughly mixed, or maybe not? Maybe if you take a sample, maybe that particular sample might contain only chatos or only ola. And what are the nafkaminas of that? So that's going to really, I'd say, be the bulk of today's daf is going to be the discussion of Bilah, particularly in the context of machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham. What are their shitas? So anyways, it's going to be an interesting daf in my opinion. So I think without further ado, let's just jump right in. Our daf begins on Daf Ein Tes Omid Beis at the Mishnah, about 5 or 10 lines or so from the bottom of Ein Tes Omid Beis. Dam Tmimim Bidam Baile Mumin. If the blood of a healthy korban gets mixed tzazamen together with the blood of a blemished korban, a puzzle blemished korban, yishafich la'ama, so you take that mixture and you spill it into the stream that runs through the azara to get it out of there. It's unusable. Now, kos bekosis, but what if a cup of blood from a blemished korban gets mixed with cups of blood from healthy korbanis? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, says Rabbi Eliezer, im karev kos echad yikarvu kol hakosis. Maybe this sounds familiar, that if one of the cups gets zrika sadamd, so you can assume that which is the cup that got zrika sadamd, the cup of the balmum, meaning that all the remaining cups are from healthy korbanos, and you can proceed to do zrika sadam with all of the remaining cups. Whereas the Chacham say the opposite. Even if all of the cups have already been zrika sadam and all that remains is just one cup, we have to be concerned that that one cup is the cup of blemished blood, and you take it and you spill it into the stream. Maybe this reminded some of us of a very similar machlokes, essentially an identical machlokes that we had with regard to the limbs of a korban ola. That if we have a bunch of korban ola limbs and there's one blemished korban ola that had gotten mixed together with all the limbs of healthy korban olas, we said if the head of one of the olas has already been offered, Rabbi Eliezer says that we can assume that it's the blemished head that was offered, and you can now offer all the rest of the heads, whereas the Chacham say even if one head is left over, you can't offer it on the Mizbeach because we have to assume it's the blemished one, right? So this same machlokes that we saw by the limbs of a korban ola, we're now seeing by the blood of korbanis when you have a cup of blemished blood mixed in with cups of healthy blood. Rabbi Eliezer says the same thing, that if one cup has already been zrika sadamd, we'll say that which cup was Zrikas Adam? The blemished cup was Zrikas Adam, and all the remaining cups are from healthy animals, and you can proceed to do Zrikas Adam with all of the remaining cups, whereas the Chachamim say, like they did by the limbs, that even if one cup remains, you have to assume it's the blemished cup, and you got to spill it into the Amma. Now, Hanitonin lematu shenisav hanitonin lemailu. If the blood of nitonin lemailu, who could tell me what nitonin lemailu is? Or no, it was the opposite. Nitonin lematu. Who could tell me what nitonin lematu is? Well, that could be an ola, could be a shlomim, could be an asham, toda. Right? These are korbanis whose blood, bechor, mixier, kilu, basically all korbanis except for either chatas behema or ola sof, though we're not talking about birds right now, I don't think. So basically a korban chatas, right? So aniton lemata would be basically all korbanos except for a korban chatas. Let's say it's talking about korban ola, right? For this daf, tomorrow's daf also, I think we're basically mostly going to be using as our example of a niton lemata, a korban ola. That got mixed with blood of a korban chata. So you have blood that got all mixed together, and in this mixture is ola blood and chatas blood. What do you do? Rabbi Eliezer Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer, what you do is, well, the chatas blood needs to be applied to the karnos hamizbech, to the top of the mizbech, to the horns at the top of the mizbech, above the chut hasikra, the chatas blood. The ola blood needs to be zrikas adamd below the chut hasikra. So what do? Rabbi Eliezer says you do both, starting with the chatas blood above the chut hasikra, because as Rashi points out, we're going to learn in the 10th parak, I think. Yes, in the 10th parak Kol HaTadir, we're going to learn that precedence goes to chatases over olazes, and therefore, says Rabbi Eliezer, not a problem. You have this, let's say, mixture of blood. That's going to be a big discussion today, as I mentioned, Bilah and mixtures, and anyways, that's going to be a big question, but let's just say you have this mixture of blood, chatas blood, ola blood mixed together. Chatas needs to be above the chut hasikra, ola needs to be below the chut hasikra. Rabbi Eliezer says not a problem. You first apply the blood above the chut hasikra, and that of course will work for the korban chatas. What about the fact that korban ola is mixed in there, and that needs to be below the chut hasikra? We'll view the korban ola like it's just water. Not a problem. And then in terms of the zrikas adam below the chut hasikra, well, in terms of the chatas, it will be shiare adam. It will be the remainders of the blood. The remainders of the blood. You'll go on the yesod mizbeach below the chut hasikra, not a problem. And in terms of the ola, well, not below the chut hasikra, you're doing zrikas adam for the korban ola. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, not a problem. You first do the blood on top for the and that will work for the chatas. For the ola, we'll just treat it like water. In terms of below, that will be the shiare adam for the chatas, and it'll be the zrikas adam for the ola. Nish gefährlich. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer yitin lemaila, not a problem. You'll first apply the blood above the chut hasikra. V'ra'ani es atachtonim milemailon ki'ilu emoim. And in terms of the korban ola blood that is being applied above the chut hasikra, I'll just view it like water. V'yavzaviten lemata, and then you will do zrikas adam below the chut hasikra, and that will work as for the shiare adam of the chatas, as well as for the zrikas adam for the ola. V'chacham om yishofich la'ama, whereas the chacham say nisht. What you do in this case, you have this combination of ola blood and chatas blood. Pour it in it. You can't use it. Pour it into the amma. We don't want you just applying it above the chut hasikra. The Rabbanan don't say we'll just view it like water. No, pour it into the stream, into the channel, and let it be taken out of the azar. V'imlo nimlach v'nosin kosher. However, the chacham say, look, even according to the Chacham, if he didn't ask what to do, and he just went ahead and applied the blood above the Chut HaSukkah, below the Chut HaSukkah, the Chacham will say, okay, no, b'diavad, the blood of the chatas works as the chatas, the ola below the chut HaSukkah works as the ola. So if you ask the shaila, they'll say spill it into the amma. However, if b'diavad a person went ahead and did it, so then they will say kosher. Hanitani b'matona achas, korbanis whose blood is zrikas adam in one zrika, in one throw. What are examples of that? Bechor, Mixier, I think Korban Pesach as well. So Nitanav Matana Achas, Shenisaivu Nitanav Matana Achas, that were mixed with other korbanos, that with other blood that is thrown in one throw. So blood of a Bechor got mixed with blood of a Mixier Be'ema. Yinosnu Matana Achas. Okay, well, one single application blood got mixed with other single application blood, so singularly apply it. Matan arba, if blood of a quadruply applicationed korban got mixed with other quadruplipied blood, quadruplipied, apply. It's a combination. It's a merger of quadruple and applied, quadruple applied. I think in English you could do that. I think you can just make Dennis, in English, can you make who cares about English? In Babble, you can make mergers of words, right, Dennis? You can take quadruple and application, quadruplication, application. Quadruplication. Where were we? So if you have, for example, a korban ola, its blood is shtayim shein arba, is applied 4 times, and you have, let's say, a korban shlomim, whose blood is applied also 4 times. So if quadruplipied blood gets mixed with other quadruplipied blood, so then just quadruple apply it and all good. Okay, so matan arba, just quadruple apply it and just apply shtein shein arba, all good. Now, ma'in arba, ma'in achas, if quadruple applied blood is mixed with single applied blood, now what do you do? So now what do? Do you single apply it or quadruple apply it? So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, matan arba. So Rabbi Eliezer says, if you have this mixture of let's say an ola and a bechor, ola, the blood needs to be shtayim shein arba, bechor needs to be matana achas. So it says Rabbi Eliezer, you apply it 4 times, shtayim shein arba, and the extras will just view it as it's water, right? In terms of the bechor, the bechor just needs the blood just applied once, just one zrikas adam. So in terms of the extras, for the bechor, we will just treat it like water. Rabbi Yoshua disagrees. He says, Yinosnu matana achas, just apply it once. Just apply the blood once. What about for the ola that you need shtayim shein arba? As we learned in Perek Beis Shammai from Dam Zvachecha Yishofech, I believe, even one application of blood technically works, and therefore in this scenario where you have blood of an ola that gets mixed with blood of a bechor, just apply it once, and and technically that it works for the ola as well. Amar Rabbi Eliezer says to Rabbi Yeshua, Arehu over al Baal Tigra. What about the lav of Baal Tigra? Don't do less on mitzvahs. So Rabbi Yeshua, if you're only applying the blood, if you're only doing 1 zrika, what about the fact that the ola needs 4 and you are doing less than what you need to be doing? And that is a violation of Baal Tigra. Don't do less. Omar le Rabbi Yoshua Reu over al Baal Tosif. Rabbi Yoshua says, yeah, but you, Rabbi Eliezer, from the perspective of the Bechor, you are in violation of Bal Tosif. You're adding. Bechor is only supposed to be one Zrika, and you're doing 4 Zrikas to accommodate the Ola. That is going to be Bal Tosif. Rabbi Eliezer responds to Rabbi Yeshua, Lo Ne'amar Bal Tosif Elikshu Be'atzmo. Oh, I didn't look this up. I wanted to make sure I'm understanding this right, but I didn't look it up. So I'm going to assume I'm understanding it right. Fingers crossed. Bal Tosif is when it affects the heart of the matter, the core of the body of the thing itself. Classic example, 5 boxes in tefillin. Right? Tefillin is made up of 4 sections, 4 boxes in the tefillin shorosh. If you add a 5th section to the tefillin shorosh, you're actually changing the physical mitzvah itself, and you're adding a section to tefillin shorosh that's supposed to be 4 sections, and you're adding a 5th section. So that would be Bal Tosif. But over here, you're not. It's blood. And the question: are you throwing the blood 1 time? You're throwing the blood 4 times. It's not affecting the body of any of any physical thing. You're just throwing it 1 time versus 4 times. That would not be Bal Tosif. Says Rabbi Eliezer. So again, Rabbi Eliezer says Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Yeshua, Lo ne'amar Bal Tosif elikshu ba'atzmo. Bal Tosif is only when you're changing the core of the thing itself, the body of the thing itself, like adding a 5th section to tefillin, but not just doing extra zrikas adam, throwing blood on the mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Yeshua says Rabbi Yeshua, Lo ne'amar Bal Tigra elikshu ba'atzmo. Rabbi Yeshua says you could say the same thing about Bal Tigra. That it's only Bal Tigra if you make tefillin of 3 sections as opposed to 4. But again, here you're not changing anything. You're just doing less zrikas adam. The Od of Rabbi Yeshua, and now Rabbi Yeshua makes his final argument, which is Kishe Nosata Avarta Bal Tosif ve'asisa ma'isa biyadecha. Kishe lo Nosata Avarta al Bal Tigra ve'lo asisa ma'isa biyadecha. Says Rabbi Yeshua, look, we have a choice between 2 bad choices. You have a mixture of Ola blood that's mixed together with Bechor blood. Bechor blood is zrikad 1 time. Ola blood is zrikad shtaim shein arba 4 times. You have 2 bad choices. Either do it 4 times at the expense of the Bechor, which would be Bal Tosef vis-a-vis the Bechor, or do it 1 time, which would be Bal Tigra vis-a-vis the Ola. 2 bad choices. So Rabbi Yeshua says if you have to choose between the 2 bad choices, choose to do less. Because by doing more, you're actively in violation of Bal Tosef. You're actively adding more zrikas for the Bechor. Bechor is only supposed to have 1, and from the perspective of the Bechor, you're adding extra zrikas to do it 4 times. Whereas, says Rabbi Yoshua, if you're doing it like me, you're doing less. So okay, you do 1 zrika. And yeah, the Ola needs more. But you're stopping after 1. You're saying, look, I don't want to be adding more because for the Bechor, I will be actively adding more than I should. Better to do less than to do more, because by doing more, you're actively in violation, whereas by doing less, you're passively in violation. And says Rabbi Yeshua, better to violate passively than to violate actively. Says Rabbi Yeshua, therefore, I say that we should only do 1 zrika in such a case. And yeah, there's a question about Tigra, but better Bal Tigra than Bal Tosef. Says the Gemara, now this is an identical discussion, argument, machlokes, discussion that we had the other day. Amar Balazar says, Hichshir Eliezer Ela Shnaim Val Echad Lo. If you remember, we had the same discussion when it came to the limbs of the Balmum Ola getting mixed together with the limbs of the kosher Olas, and we said that it says Rabbi Eliezer, if one of the heads has already been burned on the Mizbeach, you can assume that it was the Balmum, and the rest of the heads can now be offered because you can assume that they are the healthy ones. And we said you have to do 2 at a time, because by doing 2 at a time, we know only one of the we know that Sach HaKol, out of all of the heads of the animals that were mixed in there, only one of them was a Bal Mum. only one of them was the Baal Mum. Now, one of the heads was already burnt, and we could say maybe that was the Baal Mum. Now, if you take another 2 at a time from what remains, we could say, look, Sachakol, there was only one Baal Mum. By taking 2, by definition, right, maximum, only one of them, if any, only one of them can be the Baal Mum. At least one of these 2 is for sure kosher. So you could burn one of them, say, okay, that was the kosher one. And then when it comes to the other one, you could say, okay, this one is the kosher one. Then if both of them are the kosher ones, then where is the Baal Mum? The first one, the initial one that was offered was the Baal Mum, right? So says Rabbi Eliezer that, right? So says Rabbi Elazar that when Rabbi Eliezer says that once one of them has been offered, none of them should really ideally be offered because we don't know, because the Baal Mum is somewhere in there. But if one of them was offered, we could say that was the Baal Mum, and now you can offer 2 at a time. And we'll say that, says Rabbi Elazar, the same thing is here as well when it comes to cups of blood that got mixed together. You have 1 cup of blood from a animal that was a Baal Mum that gets mixed together with cups of blood from kosher animals. If one of the cups were to have been Zrikas Adam, we'll say that was the Zrikas, that was the Baal Mum Dam, that was Zrikas Adam. And in terms of all the remaining cups of blood from the kosher animals, you can offer 2 at a time, and we'll say that at least one of them is kosher, and you'll do Zrikas Adam with one of them, and then you'll say, okay, the second one, this is the kosher one, which was the Baal Mum one, the original one that was offered. Okay, so again, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Elazar, Lo hichsher Rabbi Eliezer ela shnaim shnaim, that when Rabbi Eliezer says that if one of the bloods of Baal Mum, if one of the cups of Baal Mum, if one of the cups of blood was Zrikas Adam, we'll say it's the Baal Mum blood, and therefore you can Zrikas Adam all the rest of the cups of blood. That's 2 at a time. Avol, echad lo, but not 1 at a time, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Well, according to Rabbi Elazar explaining Rabbi Eliezer. Masiv Rav Dimi, but Rav Dimi asks a question, afilu kervu kulan, chutz me'echad men yishafech la'ama. But the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and they say even if all of the cups of blood have been Zrikas Adam and only 1 cup remains, that 1 cup you would have to be concerned it's the Baal Mum, it would have to be poured into the channel, into the Amma, implying that they disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer would say in such a case, you can, right? If all that remains is 1 cup, you can Zrikas Adam it. Meaning, it sounds like Rabbi Eliezer is saying even 1 cup can be Zrikas Adam. You don't need pairs. So, Amar le Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Az Barlach, I'll explain to you, my echad zug echad. I'll explain to you what does it mean that 1 remains, a pair remains. And the Chacham say, nonetheless, pour it into the Amma. Rabbi Eliezer would say that pair can be Zrikas Adam. Utzricha, and we need both scenarios. We need the scenario of burning of the head, of the limbs of a Korban Ola that's a Baal Mum that gets mixed with the limbs of healthy Korban Olas. We need that scenario that we had the other day. And where was it? On Daf Ayin Zayin Amid Beis. And we also need this scenario of the cups of blood. How come? If we would only have the case of the limbs of the Ola, that's a Baal Mum. Rabbi Eliezer says by the limbs that if one head was offered, even though it shouldn't have been offered, because there's a concern of the Baal Mum, but if one of the heads was offered, so there Rabbi Eliezer would say, okay, fine, you can assume that was the blemished one, mishum de isavid bei kaprasu, because of course, when it comes to korbanos, the most important part of the korban is the zrikas adam. So once already you're getting up to the part where we're talking about burning limbs of the korban ola, that's post zrikas adam. So the most important part of the korban has already been done. The zrikas adam has already been done. Now we're talking about burning of the limbs. So there, I'll say, when it comes to burning of the limbs, Rabbi Eliezer says that you can be lenient and say if one of the heads was offered, you can assume that it was the Baal Mum head and you can offer the rest of the heads now. Aval beha, but in the case of the blemished blood, ema modi lihu lirabanan. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the Rabbanan here when it comes to the blood, when this is the most important part of the korban. Maybe we won't just say that, we'll just assume that the cup that was Zrikas Adam was the blemished one. Not necessarily. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer would be stringent when it comes to Zrikas Hadam, as it's the most important part of the korban where the kapara lies. V'itmar beha, and if we would only have the case of the blood, beha ka'amre rabbanon, I would say that this is where the rabbis are stringent. Aval baha, when it comes to the limbs, modu li Rabbi Eliezer, maybe they would agree with Rabbi Eliezer since it's post Zrikas Adam. Maybe they would say that if one of the heads or if the limbs of one of the animals was offered, we would say it's from the Bal Mum. Tzricha, therefore, we need both scenarios to say that the machlokas is alive and well in both scenarios, both when we're talking about the limbs of the Ola post Zrikas Adam, as well as when we are talking about the Zrikas Adam itself. In both scenarios, there is a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about what happens if one of the either cups or one of the limbs was offered. Can we assume that it is from the Baal Mum? Rabbi Eliezer says yes, the Chachamim say no. And now we get up to the I'd say main discussion of today's daf, which is a discussion about Bilah, about how do we view mixtures. Well, we've been talking about blood of a chatos that gets mixed together with blood of an ola. How do we view that mixture? Do we view that mixture like the blood of the chatas and the ola are all mixed together, so that if we, like Rabbi Eliezer had said, you can apply the blood to the top of the mizbeach and then to the bottom of the mizbeach? Do we view it as if when you apply it to the top, it's good, you can have some of the chatas blood and some of the ola blood at the top and some of the chatas blood and some of the ola blood at the bottom, that everything's all mixed together, that whatever you're doing with the blood is both the chatas and the ola? Or do we say not? Do we say that there's no Bilah? If there's no Bilah, if we don't assume that everything's mixed together, maybe when you're applying all the blood at the top, maybe actually we're not applying any chatos blood at all. Maybe it happens to be all the blood that was there happened to all be ola blood. And you did the ola above the chuta sikra, and you're doing the chatos below the chuta sikra, because maybe not all the blood isn't all mixed together, and maybe it happens to be that all the blood that you were working with at the top was the wrong blood, and at the bottom was the wrong blood. So how do we view these liquid mixtures? Do we view it like it's all thoroughly mixed together, or not? Could there be different, amounts, different sections of the liquid that are one or the other? Okay. Tanan, awesome. We learned in a Mishnah in Pareh. Tzlochis shenaflu l'socha mayim kolshu. So if you have a flask, and in that flask is mei chatos, water that has been mixed together with the ashes of the parah aduma, and this mei chatos is what's used, that we sprinkle it on somebody who's a tmei mace, somebody who came into contact with a corpse and became a tmei mace. So, of course, on day 3 and day 7, we sprinkle mechatos on this individual. What if the flask that the mechatos was in, some other water got into the flask? So now in this flask is not just mechatos, but also some other water. So again, Tanan also, we learned in the Mishnah in Pareh, Tzlochis, if you have a flask containing mechatos, shenaflu l'socha mayim kolshu, and then some other water fell into this flask, Rabbi Eliezer Omer yaze shtei hazos. So Rabbi Eliezer's suggestion is, okay, so in this flask there isn't just mechatos anymore, there's mechatos and other water. So whereas normally we would sprinkle one time on the person, on day 3, one time, and day 7 another time. But when we sprinkle on the person, we would sprinkle one time on the person. So now, sprinkle 2 times. Now we're going to have to explain why that helps. But okay, that's Rabbi Eliezer suggestion. Instead of sprinkling one time, sprinkle 2 times now. The Chacham postlin. And the Chacham say, okay, no, this is a problem. It is puzzle. There's a problem. What's the problem? Bishlam Rabbanan. So I understand how we can explain the Rabbanan's shita that it's a problem. They hold yesh Bilah. They hold that there is Bilah. They hold that in this case the contents of the flask are all mixed together, and sprinkling from the flask onto an individual means that you're sprinkling a combination of mechatos and the other water. And there is a minimum amount, there is a dose, there is a required minimum dose of mechatos. It's not just any amount, but there is a required minimum dose. I don't know what that minimum dose is, but I guess a sprinkle's worth maybe of mechatos. Ve'ein mitzdarfin la'azos, and you can't join together azos. So, according to the Chacham, I understand why they say it's possible, because now you have a flask. In the flask is a mixture of mechatos and also other water, and all that mixture is mixed together, and therefore, when sprinkling from this flask onto a tmei meis, you will be sprinkling a dose that is not 100% mechatos, but it's a mixture of mechatos and this other water. And you need a minimum, there's a required minimum dose of mechatos that you need, and you're not going to have that minimum dose of mechatos. And therefore, the tmei meis cannot count as a sprinkling of mechatos. Maybe you'll suggest, like Rabbi Eliezer says, well, why don't you just add another sprinkling, and the two sprinklings together will at least be one dose of mechatos. They hold you can't, doses don't combine. You can't combine sprinklings. And therefore, say the rabbis, you can't combine sprinklings. You have to just look at an individual sprinkling. That sprinkling is going to be a mixture of mechatos and other water. There will be less than a required dose of mechatos, and therefore they simply say pasul. So the Chachamim say that there is Bilah, and that's part of the reason why they would say that this flask, the contents of this flask, is pasul. Ella, Rabbi Eliezer, my kasaver. How do we understand Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer has an interesting suggestion, which is double the dose, and that is the solution. Just double sprinkle, and that's the solution. How come double sprinkling is a solution? I mean, I feel like on a simple level, it feels kind of like a hack. Like maybe we're making an assumption. Maybe we're assuming, well, if there's not enough in one dose, well, if you double it, then for sure, then we should have more than enough, right? But is that necessarily true? Rabbi Eliezer, Micah Sover, what's Rabbi Eliezer's svar? What's the operating logic here? Ika Sover, ein Bilah. If he says ein Bilah, so you have in this flask mechatos and water, and we don't treat it as though they are thoroughly mixed. And it could be if you are sprinkling, maybe the entire sprinkle is just the extra water. Maybe there's no mechatos in the sprinkle at all. So kimazish te'azos ma'have. But if we say ein Bilah, well then what does doubling the dose do? What does double sprinkling do? Maybe both sprinkles are from the water. Dilma tavayu maya kamaze. If we say ein Bilah, then potentially doubling the sprinkle doesn't help, because you can double the sprinkle, but if both sprinkles are entirely water and not mechatas, you've accomplished nothing by double sprinkling. Elakosaver yesh Bilah. Okay, so let's explore that maybe he holds that there is Bilah, and therefore when you sprinkle, it will be a mixture of mechatas and regular water. Now, ikasaver ein haza'a tzricha shiur lam lishtei hazos. Now, if he holds that there is no minimum required dose of mechatas, well then why do you need the double sprinkle? One sprinkle should be sufficient. If we're saying Bilah, that all of the contents are mixed together, which means that in a sprinkle, there's going to be at least some mechatas and some regular water. If he holds that there is no minimum required dose, so that means that any amount of mechatas is sufficient, well then one sprinkle should be sufficient, because it will contain mechatas and regular water, and any amount of mechatas is what is required, and therefore one sprinkle should be sufficient. Elakasavar hazat tzricha shir. Okay, fine. So Rabbi Eliezer says there is a minimum required dose for for mechatos. V'i kasover ein mitzdarfin leazos. Now, if Rabbi Eliezer holds that the sprinkles don't join together, don't combine, like the right there, that's what the rabbis had said. The rabbi said that the sprinklings don't combine, and therefore you can't get that shear. So if Rabbi Eliezer holds that the sprinklings don't combine, well then kimazet shteazos my have. Well then, what does a double sprinkle accomplish if they don't combine? V'yinami mitzdarfin lazos, and even if you say that the sprinklings do combine, miyemer de malile shiura. How do you know that you're going to have enough in the double sprinkle, right? Meaning, according to Rabbi Eliezer, if we say yesh Bilah and the sprinkle is a combination of mechatas and other water, and we require a minimum dose of mechatas, and we say that the sprinklings could join together, but still, what if like each sprinkle was 75% water and only 25% mechatas? Doing two sprinklings only gets you to 50% of a dose of mechatas. You still have less, right? So sure, doubling the dose will increase the amount and maybe will increase the likelihood of having enough of a dose of mechatas. So if you double the sprinkle, but it's not a guarantee that you'll have a full dose of mechatas. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, how does doubling the sprinkle guarantee a full dose of mechatas? Now we're going to see three suggestions from Rish Lakish, Rava, and Rav Ashi. I'm going to drink a little bit of water and then we'll jump in. Okay, let's have a look at what Rish Lakish says. Rish Lakish says, Rish Lakish le'olam yesh Bilah. So says Rish Lakish, yesh Bilah. Rabbi Eliezer holds that there is Bilah and the mechatas and water get mixed together in any sprinkle. Any sprinkles combined of both mechatas and regular water. V'azot tzricha shir, and there is a minimum required dose. Okay. And then you can also add umitzdarfin lazos, and the two sprinkles can combine. And says Rava, says Rish Lakish, what got mixed together in that flask is one dose of mechatas together with one dose of water. So the entire contents of the flask is two sprinkles worth, each sprinkle being, having enough of a dose. And we say that each sprinkle will yesh Bilah, so it's going to be a combination of mechatas and the water, but the entire contents of the flask is basically the equivalent of a one full dose of mechatas and one full dose of water, and therefore by sprinkling twice and applying two full doses to the tmei meis, you are definitely getting at least one dose of mechatas and also a dose of the other water, but you have at least a full dose of mechatas. Rava Amar Lolam Yesh Bilah. Rava also says that there is Bilah. V'azah eina tzricha shir. Now, according to Rava, there is no minimum required dose of mechatas. Any amount of mechatas is enough. Okay, so therefore, if the contents of the flask are all mixed together and you sprinkle from the flask, and immediately you're sprinkling a combination of mechatas and other water, and there's no minimum required dose, which means that any amount of mechatas is enough mechatas, so one sprinkling should be sufficient, right? So why does Rabbi Eliezer require two sprinklings? Because of the Uncle Mati effect. If you remember the Uncle Mati effect. The Uncle Mati effect is that you can increase the amount of ketchup you have by adding more water. Add more water, get more ketchup. So in this case of mechatas, you might think add more water, get more mechatas. but we don't want you adding more water to increase the volume of mei chatas. And therefore, as a fine, we say, look, in that flask, there was mechatas, there was extra water, and there's no minimum required dose. And when you sprinkled, it was all mixed together, and there was at least some mechatas in the sprinkle. Sure. And technically speaking, that's enough. But because we want to discourage anybody from the Uncle Mati effect, from adding water to the mechatas to increase the amount of it, so to discourage adding water to the mechatas, we say, right, we require you to do an additional sprinkle as a fine. So Rish Lakish and Rava both hold Yesh Bilah according to Rabbi Eliezer. Now comes Rav Ashi and he says, right, so one says, right, so the rabbis added a second sprinkle as a fine so that you wouldn't be benefiting from the Uncle Mati effect. Rav Ashi Amar says, Rav Ashi, so you can add some words over here, which I will add. Mayim kolshu tanan ve'ein bila. So Rav Ashi says, look, the amount of water that was added to the flask, to the mechatas, was just a minimum amount. There was very little water, enough for one sprinkle's worth. Now he says ein bila, and therefore yazish azos. Says Rav Ashi, the amount of water that was added to the mechatos was a minimal amount, right? And he also says ein shir. I think according to Rashi, he says that there's no minimum required amount. So now says Rav Ashi, okay, the amount of water that was added was a very minimal amount. The amount of like one sprinkle. You do one sprinkle of water, we do one sprinkle on the tmei meis. That is the amount of water that was added to the flask. Now, according to Rav Ashi, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is ein bila. There's no bila. We don't view it like all the contents of the flask are mixed together, which means that if there is one sprinkle's worth of water that was added to the flask, it could be that when you do one sprinkle, that sprinkle was entirely the added water. There was no mechatas there. So therefore you have to do a second sprinkle. That will guarantee that you'll have mechatas, because the amount of water that was added was just the equivalent of one sprinkle. So it could be that the first sprinkle was entirely water, but if that's the case, then the second sprinkle will be mechatas. So that is why Rabbi Eliezer requires a second sprinkle according to Rav Ashi. Okay, so we saw three opinions on how to explain Rabbi Eliezer's requirement to do a double dose, to do a double sprinkle of this mechatas that water has been added to. Rish Lakish says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, there is Bilah. It is all mixed together, and you require the double dose because the amount in the flask was basically 2 sprinkles worth, and it's all mixed together. So by sprinkling both, you will have a shear, a minimum required amount of mechatas. According to Rava, also there is Bilah, and there's no minimum amount, a minimum required dose of mechatas, and the extra sprinkle is just a fine. And according to Rav Ashi, he says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there is no Bilah. And there was just a minimum amount, 1 sprinkle's worth of water, and therefore there's a chance that the whole first sprinkle was the water. So you need a second sprinkle to guarantee mechatas. Now, we are going to ask a question on Rish Lakish, and we're also going to question Rav Ashi, leaving just Rava's Shita intact. So here's the question on Rish Lakish. Meisvei, we have a contradiction against Rish Lakish. Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe, L'divrei Rebbe Eliezer, according to Rebbe Eliezer, Hazah kolshu mitaheres. Any amount of mechatas is mitaher. Now, Rish Lakish had said that there is a minimum required dose. Hazah ain't tzricha shir. There is no minimum required dose of mechatas. Hazah mechza kosher mechza posel. You can have a hazah that's even 50% mechatas, that's kosher, and 50% regular water, it would work. So that is a question on Rish Lakish, who says that there is a minimum shiur, that there is a minimum required dose for mechatas. Rebbe seems to be saying that according to Rabbi Eliezer, that is not the case. There is no minimum required dose. The Od Tanya, and we have another brisa that is a problem for Rav Ashi. You can skip the next word. Hanitonin lemaila shenis'aru b'nitonin lemata, that blood that should be applied above the chut sikra, chatas blood, shenis'aru b'nitonin lemata, that got mixed zusammen with blood that is applied below the chut sikra. Let's call it ola blood. Rabbi Eliezer, says Rabbi Eliezer, yitein lemaila. Okay, so start by applying the blood above the chut sikra. I'm going to add some extra words over here. And I will view, right, the fact that it's a mixture of chatas blood and ola blood, and Rabbi Eliezer is advising to apply the blood above the chut sikra, which is all fine and good for the chatas blood in the mixture. But what about the ola blood? We'll view the ola blood above the chut sikra as though it's just water. Ve'atachtonim alu lo, and then you apply the blood below the chut sikra, and that will work doubly as the shirayim of the chatas being applied below the chut sikra, being thrown below the chut sikra, as well as the blood of the ola now being shtaim shein arbad below the chut sikra as well. Now, the omart ein bilah. Now, if you say that there is no bilah, Rav Ashi, why are we saying that this works? Amai alula, why does this work? Dilma kayoyev elyonim limata v'atachtonim limayla. If you say ein bilah, right? If you say that yesh bilah, if you say that there is bilah, so then we'll say, okay, Rabbi Eliezer is suggesting apply the blood above the chut sikra, and that's a combination of chatas and ola, and the chatas is great, the ola will view as water. Below the chut sikra, this combination will be the shiori adam of the chatos, as well as the shtaim shein arba of the ola, all good. But if you say ein bilah, there's some serious questions here. Because what if all of the blood that was applied above the chut sikra was actually ola blood? There was no chatas blood in there. And all of the blood that was applied below the chut sikra was all ola, was all chatas blood. There was no ola blood in there. I hope I didn't make a mistake. Right? If we say ein bilah, there's a chance that all of the blood above the chut sikra was ola, and all the blood below the chut sikra was chatas. Bad news. So this suggestion only makes sense if we say yesh bilah. It doesn't make sense if we say ein bilah, which is a question on Rav Ashi, who says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, ein bilah. Right, again, v'yomart, if you say ein bilah, amai alulo, why does this suggestion work? Dilma kayoyev elyonim lemata, maybe the chatas blood was applied below the chut sikra, v'tachtonim lemayla, and the ola blood above the chut sikra, mamish a mess. Hacha b'maya skinan. So the Gemara answers, well, and basically to point out, essentially the rest of the daf, we're actually going to get about halfway onto Pei Aleph from Aleph. Essentially the rest of the daf is going to be focused on Rav Ashi's opinion, that Rav Ashi had said that according to Rabbi Eliezer, ein bilah, and we're going to keep on questioning if that is really a viable suggestion to say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, ein bilah. So here's question number one. How can you say according to Rabbi Eliezer, ein bilah? Because what if the chatas was below and the ola was above? So the answer is, and we'll read it inside in a second, the answer is, well, we're not talking about an even split. It's not an even split of chatas blood and ola blood. It's 60-40, let's say. 60% chatas blood, 40% ola blood. 60% chatas blood, 40% ola blood. And now 50% of the blood is being applied above the chut sikra. Now if 50% of the blood is being applied above the chut sikra, maximum all of the Ola blood was above the Chut HaSikra, but you'll still have 10% of the blood that's Chatas, right? 40% of the total blood was Ola blood, and 50% of all the blood was applied above the Chut HaSikra. So at the very minimum, you can have 10% of the total blood being applied above the Chut HaSikra, and then below the Chut HaSikra, it's all just going to be, in that case, there wouldn't be any Ola blood, but it would all be the Shirayim of the Chatas. So says the Gemara inside, and here what are we talking about? Kigon, Tika Ruba Elyonim. The majority of the blood was Chatas blood. Let's call it 60%. V'kayoiv l'mayla shir tachtonim v'od. And above, when Rabbi Eliezer says, apply the blood above, we're applying all of the amount of the Ola blood, all 40%, v'od, and some more. Let's call it 50%. So all of the Ola blood is being, so even if all of the Ola blood is being applied above the Chut HaSikra, right? According to Rav Ashi says, Ein Bilah, so you can have a scenario where it's not evenly distributed in the mixture, but rather you could say all of the Ola blood ended up above the Chut HaSikra. But that would only be 40% worth of the blood. 50% worth of the blood was applied above the Chut HaSikra, so you can have another 10%, which would be Chatas blood. So you can have Chatas blood above the Chut HaSikra. Hatachtonim alulo katani, but didn't we say though that, but also the blood below the Chut HaSikra also works? Doesn't that apply even for the Ola? Shtayim shein arba? L'shem shirayim. No. When we say that below the Chut HaSikra also works as shirayim of the Chatas, but of course, we know by Korban Chatas, the blood is applied to the corners of the Mizbeach at the top, and then all the leftover blood is poured on the Yisod of the Mizbeach. So we're saying that, so Rav Ashi would explain that according to Rabbi Eliezer, there is no Bilah. And what's Rabbi Eliezer's suggestion with apply the blood above and below? What we're saying is apply the blood above the Chut HaSikra. And it's not an even mixture. 60% Chatas, 40% Ola. Maximum, all 40% of the Ola was above the Chut HaSikra, but you're still going to have an additional 10%, which is Chatas blood. So you'll have Chatas blood above the Chut HaSikra, which would mean that in that case, all the remaining blood is Chatas blood, and you're applying it, you're pouring it, or whatever, throwing it below the Chut HaSikra, and that would be the Shiari Adam of the Chatas maximum. So that's how Rav Ashi would explain this according to Rabbi Eliezer, while maintaining Ein Bilah. Toshma, come in here. Nosan lemata v'lo nimlach. If he didn't ask what to do in this scenario, right? The blood of the Chatas and the Ola got mixed up together. And the Kohen didn't ask what to do. If he would have asked, Rabbi Eliezer would have said, apply it above the Chut HaSikra first. The Chacham would have said, spill it out into the Amma, but he didn't ask. And Nosan lemata v'lo nimlach, he started below the Chut HaSikra. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yachzor v'yitein l'mayla. Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, no problem. Okay, so you did Zrikas Adam below the Chut HaSikra to begin with. Okay, now apply the blood above the Chut HaSikra. V'atachtonim olulo, and the blood below the Chut HaSikra also works. So again, the question is, if you say that there's no Bilah, don't we have to be concerned that it was the Ola blood above and the Chatas blood below? Hachanam beruba elyonim. Here also, we're talking about where the majority of the blood was Chatas blood, 60%, let's say, v'kayov l'mayla shir tachtonim v'od, and above the Chut HaSikra is 50% of the blood, which could be all 40% of the Ola blood plus more Chatas blood. V'tachtonim alulo katani, but didn't we say that the blood below the Chut HaSikra is going to work as well? The Shem Shiraim, it works for the Shiraim of the Chatas, even though it's retroactive, which is interesting, right? Because we're talking about where he didn't ask a Shaila first. He took the blood and did Zrikas Adam below the Chut HaSikra first. Rabbi Eliezer would then say, okay, now take the other 50% of the blood and apply it above the chut ha-sikra, and we're saying that would count for because we're saying ein bilah, right? So there's a chance that all the 50% that was above the chut ha-sikra included the entirety of the ola blood, which would mean that, okay, so 40% of the blood that was applied, 40% of the main blood being applied above the chut ha-sikra was the entirety of the ola blood, but there was still 10% of the chatas, and so you have the chatas above, and retroactively would say that all of the blood below the chut ha-sikra was the shirayim of the chatas. Okay, so still we managed to explain Rabbi Eliezer's shita while maintaining ein bilah. Tashma, come in here, nisanan l'mayla v'lo nimlach. If he applied the blood above the chut ha-sikra without asking, right? So there was this combination of chatas blood mixed together with ola blood, and he didn't ask. If he would have asked, the chacham would have said, spill it out into the amma. He didn't ask, and he went and applied the blood above the chut ha-sikra, which is what Rabbi Eliezer would have suggested. So Nisan and the Ma'alev lo nimlach, he applied the blood above the chut ha-sikra. He didn't ask first. Elu ve'elu modim. So at this point, both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim even agree that at this point he should do zrikas adam below the chut ha-sikra, because while the Chachamim would not suggest to apply the blood above the chut ha-sikra, since it's going to include the ola blood, and they don't say we'll just view it as water, so they would not suggest to apply the combined blood above the chut ha-sikra. However, if you already did it, so they would say, okay, well, fine, you already did it. You may as well now do zrikas adam below the chut ha-sikra. Ve'elu alu lo. And that would work now for both the chatas, which was applied above the chut ha-sikra, and the ola below the chut ha-sikra. So now, interesting, what we're saying is elu va'elu, right? Ve'elu va'elu alulo, that both the chatas and the ola are working. Up until now, we've been saying no, it's not going to be both. It's only going to be the chatas. That you'll have above the applications of the chatas blood at the corners of the mizbeach at the top, and the shiari chatas at the shiari adam at the bottom. But over here, we're saying not only the chatas works, but also it's going to work for the ola as well. Hachanami beruba. So here also we're saying where the majority, beruba elyonim, the majority of the blood was chatas blood. And above he's applying 50%, which would maximum include all of the ola blood plus some of the chatas blood. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if you say ein bilah. But it says that it worked not just for the chatas, but for the ola as well. And if it's Rabbi Eliezer and ein bilah, well then there is a possibility that all of the ola blood was applied above the chut ha-sikra, in which case none of it was where it's supposed to be, below the chut ha-sikra. How could it have worked for the ola? Mikatani elu va'elu modim. It doesn't say that both Rabbi Eliezer and the Chacham agree that both the chatas and the ola work. No. Elu va'elu alulo katani seif asan l'rabbanan damri yesh bilah. That when we say that it works for both the chatas and the ola, that is not according to Rabbi Eliezer. According to Rabbi Eliezer, only the chatas works. According to Chachamim, though, both the chatas and the ola would work, because the Chachamim say yesh bilah. This whole discussion about ein bilah is according to Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim say yesh bilah, as we had already said on Daf Pei Amud Aleph, right? We had said B'shlam Rabbanan Tzaveh yesh bilah. Right, we had said on that payal that according to Chacham yesh bilah. So according to Chacham yesh bilah, which means that even though they would not suggest to apply the blood above the chut ha-sikra, since it includes the ola, which doesn't belong there, and they don't want to view it as water, but if he didn't ask the question and he immediately applied the blood above the chut ha-sikra, Well, they would say, look, it counts for the korban chatas, and in terms of, right, and they're saying yesh bilah, so that would include chatas blood and ola blood, and when you do zrikas adam, then below the chuta sikra, it would also include chatas blood and ola blood, and therefore the chatas would count as the shiari adam of the chatas, and the ola blood would be the shtayim shein arba for the ola. So according to the chachamim, it would work elu va'elu alulo. It would work both for the chatas and for the ola. However, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you could say that he holds ein bilah, and therefore there's a possibility that all of the ola blood was above the chuta sikra where it does not belong, and therefore only the chatos works according to Rabbi Eliezer. But again, we can explain this brisa while still maintaining that according to Rabbi Eliezer, ein bilah, like Rav Ashi says. Tashma, coming here from our Mishnah, nitonim b'matona achas, that we say in our Mishnah that bechor, blood of a korban bechor that is applied in one application, that gets mixed together with a korban meiser behema, which is also applied once, which is one zrika on the mizbeach. So you do one zrika on the mizbeach. The omart ein bilah, or however, if you say ein bilah, and this is according to both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. We saw machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua when it comes to bechor that gets mixed together with ola, right? Ma'in arba with ma'in echod. But when it comes to this scenario where blood of a bechor and blood of a meiser behema get mixed together, there's no argument. So Rabbi Eliezer agrees with this. That, okay, if blood of a bechor and blood of meiser behema, which are both one zrika korbanis, so you do one zrika, shoin. The omart, and if you say ein bilah, but if you say ein bilah, which means that the zrika that you've done may only exclusively contain the blood of the bechor or the blood of the meiser behema. So why does doing one zrika for both of them work? What if 100% of the blood that was zrikad was, let's say, the bechor and not the meiser behema? So it won't work for the meiser behema. Kigon shenis arvu achas be'achas. Well, it's talking about where there was one shi'ur's worth of, I guess, one zrika's worth of bechor blood and one zrika's worth of meiser behema blood, and you do a zrika for each, and therefore memela you're doing zrika for each. So when it says one zrika, it means one zrika for each of the bloods. Ma'in arba, but we also said that when blood of an ola, let's say, gets mixed together with blood of a shlamim, so if you're just going to do shtayim shein arba, what if the shtayim shein arba that you're doing is exclusively that of the ola blood? What about the shlamim blood? So achanamishin is arbu arba be'arba. So you could say the same thing, that there was enough for shtayim shein arba of the ola blood as well as for the shlamim blood, and therefore you do shtayim shein arba with each of these shi'urs. Matan arba, matan achas. But what about when ola blood gets mixed together with bechor blood? Okay, so now you have blood that requires shtayim shein arba and blood that requires one zrika. B'chitema ochinami, and you'll say the same thing over here. So there was enough blood for shtayim shein arba and enough blood for one zrika, and you do one zrika and you do shtayim shein arba, and therefore you're covering all your bases, right? If you're going to say ochinami here as well, binis arvu arba be'achas. You have enough for shtayim shein arba and you have enough for one zrika, and you do one zrika and you do shtayim shein arba. If that's the case, Amr Yeshua Areyu over al Bal Tosif. But one second, then we got into this whole question about Tosif, right? Meaning, if we're saying that you're doing shtayim shein arba that counts for both of them, so then I understand the question. How are you doing four zrikas for bechor, which only requires one, you're doing too much. But if you're saying that you're basically doing one zrika for the bechor, shtayim shein arba for the ola, what's the Baal Tosif? You're giving each korban the treatment it needs. So what's the whole discussion about Tosif? Again, that's the case. B'Yoshua says, "Are you over about Tosif? You're in violation about Tosif." What about Tosif are we talking about? For the bechor, you're doing one zrika. For the ola, you're doing shtayim shein arba. So how are you going to explain this as ein bilah? If you say that they're all mixed together and you're doing one zrika, okay, so I understand how there's Baal Tosif. Ella, Amar Ravit, rather says Ravit, the balulo plige ki plige bekosis. Look, our Mishnah, and actually all of these brises and everything that we've been talking about, with blood of the chatas and blood of the ola, friends, listen up, friends. This is not talking about where they're all mixed together. We're not talking about where the blood of the chatas and the blood of the ola, or the blood of the ola and the blood of the bechor all got mixed together and you have one vessel full of blood of both animals. No. Says Rava, that's not what we're talking about. Sure, when it came to the mechatos of the para aduma in Mishnayis in para, and some water got mixed into the flask, yeah, that's talking about Bilah. Sure, that's talking about a combination. But when it came to the blood of the korbanos that we've been talking about, like we said in our Mishnah, kos bikosis, a cup gets mixed together with other cups. That's what we're talking about when it comes to the blood. That's where the machlokes when it comes to the blood of the korbanos is when cups are getting mixed together. There's no mixture. There's no bilah. We're not talking about bilah over here. We're talking about when cups of the korbanos get mixed together. Rabbi Eliezer Islay Rowan, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he would say that we can view, right? So for example, if you have cups of chatas blood and cups of ola blood, so he says that you can apply them above the chuta sikra, below the chuta sikra, and we'll view, Rabbi Eliezer would say, we'll view the ola bloods as though they're water when they're above the chuta sikra. And they say, whereas the rabbis don't say of, whereas the rabbis don't hold of rowan, and therefore they say you can't just apply it above the chuta sikra, and they'll say you have to spill it out into the amma. But we're not talking about where they are mixed together. We're talking about where they are in separate vessels. And also you can say the same thing when it comes to the ola and the bechor. Again, we're talking about koses. We're not talking about bilah. So there's no question about how you're viewing the blood that's being that's being thrown. Uvebalu lo plige, but is that really so? Is that really true that they don't argue about when the blood is mixed together? V'atani, we're learning about so Amr Rabbi Yehuda says Rabbi Yehuda lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer v'chacham al dam chatos shnizar b'dam ola sheikar. That Rabbi Eliezer and the chacham agree that when it comes to blood of an ola that's been mixed together with blood of a chatos, that it would be offered on the mizbeach. B'roveh v'nir v'shelo yikar, and blood, if it gets mixed with the blood of a rovea, an animal that had bia with a woman or was bia with from a man, should not be offered. Where do they argue? Aldam tmimo shenisar b'dam bailas mum, on blood of a healthy animal that got mixed together with blood of a mum animal. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer, Yikarev, bein bibalul, bein bikosus. That can be offered whether we're talking about that the blood is mixed together or in cups. V'chacham lo yikarev, whereas the rabbis say don't offer it. So the Gemara answers, look, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehuda, aliba to Rabbi Eliezer, masni bein bibalul bikosus, bein bikosus. Rabban bikosus plige. Look, this brisa was Rabbi Yehuda lo nechleku, etc. This brisa was according to Rabbi Yehuda. Sure, they argue also by balul, but according to the Chachamim's view, right, in the way that our Mishnah is that they even argue when it comes to the chatas and the ola being mixed together. As we saw in our Mishnah, the Chacham says spell it out. Rabbi Eliezer says that you can offer it above and then below. So the Chachamim, however, they are not talking about where it's mixed together. They are only talking about where it is in the cups, and therefore there is no raya from our Mishnah or from any of the prices that we brought earlier about what Rabbi Eliezer's opinion would be when it comes to Bilah. Sure, according to how Rabbi Yehuda learns it, so we're saying that the machlokas would be by Bilah as well, but when it's mixed as well, but according to the way that our Mishnah reads, and according to the other brises, we would say it's talking about koses, separate cups, not mixtures, and we would not have to commit to Bilah. You can still argue Ein Bilah according to Rabbi Eliezer, like Rav Ashi holds. Friends, that was Daf 80 of Masechta Zevachim. On Daf 80, we learned all about blood mixtures, whether that's actually the blood being mixed together or whether it's different cups being mixed together. But we saw in our Mishnah about healthy animals with blemished animals. We saw chatas being mixed with ola. We saw ola being mixed with bechor, all sorts of blood mixtures. And then, of course, we kind of had like a flashback to other Gemaras that we had earlier with Rabbi Eliezer saying that if one of the cups of blood was Zrikas Adam, you could assume that it was the blemished ones, and then you can offer the rest of the cups because you can assume that's from the healthy one. And then Rabbi Elazar explained that that's dafka if you do two at a time, like we had seen with the limbs of the ola. And then we got into that big discussion about Bilah. When you have a mixture of liquids, do you view it as if all of the liquids have been all mixed up together and that any sample from the liquid would contain all of the elements of the liquid? Or do we not say Bilah, which means that the sample of that combined liquid could potentially contain just one of the types of liquid? The Chacham say we don't say Bilah. Wait, what? No, the Chacham say we do say Bilah. Oops. The Chacham say that we do say Bilah. And we saw by the Afer, the Mechatas of the Para Aduma, that if water gets into there, the Mechatas is possible because they say that there is a minimum requirement and all the mixture is all mixed together, and we can't assume that there is a minimum requirement met for mechatos. Rabbi Eliezer's opinion was a machlokas. Rish Lakish and Rava said that according to Rabbi Eliezer there is Bilah. However, Rav Ashi says that there's no Bilah, and then we kind of went on a discussion for about half of the daf trying to figure out if Rav Ashi's assertion that according to Rabbi Eliezer there's no Bilah can really stand up to all of the different brises. And in the end, we managed to explain all of them according to Rav Ashi, that there's no Bilah according to Rabbi Eliezer. Friends, that was Daf 80 of Masechta Zevachim. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.